On the 23rd of December, 1934, a military parade ground in northern Venezuela hosted an event that the invited foreign military attachés would spend the rest of their careers trying to explain in their official reports. The occasion was a display of Venezuelan armed strength, the kind of ceremonial demonstration that small nations stage periodically to remind their neighbors that starting a war with them would be more complicated than it might appear. The first part of the parade went as expected. Italian-manufactured light tankettes rolled across the ground in formation, small and fast and modern-looking, the kind of equipment that any serious military establishment in the mid-1930s would be proud to display. The attachés made their notes. The crowd applauded at the appropriate moments. Everything was proceeding according to the familiar choreography of military ceremony. Then the second vehicles appeared, and the choreography stopped. What came onto the parade ground next was something that none of the observers, not the foreign military professionals with their training and their binoculars, not the civilian crowd with their enthusiasm, not the Venezuelan officers who had presumably been briefed on what they were about to see, had any existing mental category for. It was roughly the size and general shape of a large turtle's shell that had been constructed from steel plates, mounted on what appeared to be a truck chassis, modified with partial track systems at the rear, topped with a small rotating dome containing a machine gun, and fitted at the front with two rectangular viewing apertures that gave the entire assembly the unsettling appearance of a face. One American observer present at the event later recorded his reaction in a dispatch that his superiors filed and forgot about for decades. His exact words, stripped of the diplomatic language that surrounded them, communicated a single essential question. What exactly was he looking at? He was looking at the tortuga. In Spanish, the word means turtle. In Venezuelan military history, it means the most impractical, most theoretically confused, most aerodynamically peculiar, and, by any rational measure of the relationship between military hardware and military outcomes, most surprisingly successful armored vehicle ever constructed in Latin America. The story of how it came to exist requires understanding the man who ordered it, the engineer who designed it, the historical sketch that inspired it, and the geopolitical problem that made a convincing-looking but functionally limited armored vehicle not just adequate, but genuinely effective as a strategic instrument. All four of these elements are individually unlikely. Together, they produced something that should not have worked and demonstrably did. The man sitting in the reviewing stand, watching his turtle-shaped vehicles parade across the ground, was in his late 70s, had been the effective ruler of Venezuela for over a quarter century, and had not appeared in public in the capital city for years. He governed from a private estate outside the main population centers, conducting the business of state from what contemporary accounts describe as a rocking chair positioned beneath an enormous rubber tree, an image that captures something essential about his relationship to conventional expectations of how power should be exercised and displayed. His path to that rocking chair had been unconventional. He had grown up in the mountain interior of the country with minimal formal education, had worked in cattle and rural commerce before attaching himself to a more prominent political figure during a period of upheaval, and had converted his position as a trusted subordinate into absolute control of the country when that figure was absent abroad and physically unable to return to contest the transition. Once in power, he demonstrated a considerable talent for the specific skills that maintaining power in that environment required, identifying threats before they materialized, rewarding loyalty with material benefits that made disloyalty economically irrational, and maintaining sufficient control of information that organized opposition could not develop coherent leadership. The results of his long tenure were genuinely mixed in ways that defy simple characterization. The country's road network expanded substantially under his administration. Aviation infrastructure was established. The national debt was eliminated. The discovery of petroleum in commercial quantities transformed Venezuela's fiscal position and gave the government resources that previous administrations could only have imagined. He negotiated the terms of foreign oil exploitation with sufficient skill that the country captured a meaningful share of the revenue rather than simply watching foreign companies extract the resource and leave. The shadow side of this record was equally substantial. Political opposition was dealt with through imprisonment and means that did not stop at imprisonment. The country functioned in many practical respects as a personal asset of the ruler rather than as a state with autonomous institutions. The number of his illegitimate children, distributed across the population and often installed in positions of administrative responsibility, was cited by contemporary observers as an index of his approach to governance that was difficult to interpret as anything other than systematic. By 1934, this man was approaching the end of his life without having arranged any clear mechanism for succession, and the problem he was facing had arrived from the direction of a neighboring country that had recently demonstrated, in a small and inconclusive but nonetheless real war, that it was willing to use military force to resolve territorial disputes. The conflict that worried him had not involved Venezuela directly. Colombia and Peru had fought a limited war over a disputed territory in the Amazon River system, a piece of jungle containing two small towns whose combined population was well under 2,000 people, but whose position on navigable water gave them strategic significance disproportionate to their size. The fighting had been small in scale by any absolute measure. The forces involved numbered in the hundreds on each side. The air power committed was measured in single digits, and the naval component required purchasing vessels abroad because neither party had adequate domestic maritime capacity. The conflict ended when the Peruvian president was assassinated and his successor decided the disputed jungle was not worth the continuation of hostilities. Colombia had won, and Colombia, emboldened by that outcome, had begun making noises about Venezuelan territory that Venezuelan ears found distinctly unwelcome. The ruler in his rocking chair assessed the military balance with the clarity that decades of political survival had given him. Both sides had comparable infantry forces, comparable artillery, comparable small air arms. Neither side had armor of any kind, not a single tank, not a single armored car. The limited conflict had been fought entirely with infantry and light guns and the handful of aircraft that could be kept operational. This assessment generated a strategic insight that was simple, elegant, and entirely correct. If Venezuela could field armored vehicles of any kind, and Colombia had none, Venezuela would possess a qualitative advantage in the military balance regardless of whether those armored vehicles were actually capable of performing effectively in combat. The deterrent value of armor does not require that the armor work. It requires only that the potential adversary believe it might work and conclude that testing the proposition carries unacceptable risk. Purchasing European armor was possible in principle but slow and expensive. The ruler wanted a capability demonstration quickly, before the diplomatic situation deteriorated further. The solution was to build something domestically, immediately, from available materials, with whatever technical talent could be assembled for the purpose. The contract went to a naval shipyard. This decision has attracted retrospective commentary from military historians, most of it unkind, but it contains a logic that is not entirely without merit. A shipyard has metalworking infrastructure, workers experienced in cutting and forming steel plate, and engineering personnel capable of reading technical drawings and translating them into physical structures. None of these capabilities are specific to ships. The fact that nobody at the facility had any experience with armored fighting vehicles was a gap in expertise that the urgency of the project did not allow time to fill by any other means. The engineer assigned to lead the project had no background in military vehicle design. He had not consulted with anyone who did. He had not studied the development of armored vehicles in the countries that had been building them for 2 decades since the first appearance of tanks in the previous World War. What he had was a familiarity with the engineering notebooks of a 15th-century Italian artist and polymath, and a conviction that the conceptual framework contained in those notebooks was directly applicable to his assignment. Leonardo da Vinci had, in the 1480s, prepared drawings for a mobile armored fighting platform intended for the Duke of Milan. The device, as sketched, was a low, conical structure of wood reinforced with angled metal plates, propelled by 8 men operating hand cranks connected to the wheels and armed with a ring of light cannon positioned around its perimeter. The angled surfaces of the outer shell were a deliberate engineering choice. Leonardo understood that a projectile striking an angled surface is deflected rather than arrested, reducing the energy transferred to the structure behind it. This concept, sloped armor increasing effective protection, is correct. It is the same principle that 20th century tank designers would independently develop and apply. The fact that Leonardo had understood it in the Renaissance is one of the genuine engineering insights embedded in his notebooks. There was, however, a problem with the original design. The gearing that connected the hand cranks to the wheels was arranged in a configuration that caused opposing wheels to rotate in opposing directions simultaneously, which meant that the vehicle could not actually move. Whether this was an error or a deliberate act of sabotage by an inventor with philosophical objections to contributing to warfare is a question that historians of Renaissance engineering continue to debate without resolution. What is not debated is the practical consequence. The Leonardo fighting vehicle was never built in the 15th century because, as drawn, it did not work. The Venezuelan engineer studying these drawings in 1934 was aware of the sloped armor principle and adopted it as the primary structural logic of his design. He was apparently less focused on the propulsion question, since he was replacing human-powered cranks with a motor vehicle chassis, and the gearing problem did not directly translate. What he took from Leonardo was the visual language, the low, angled, dome-shaped form that gave the final vehicle its remarkable appearance, and the engineering principle of presenting oblique surfaces to incoming fire. The chassis he selected was a 6-wheel American truck of a type that was available in Venezuela and offered adequate payload capacity and sufficient ground clearance for the additional weight of steel plate, armament, and crew. The powertrain was a 4-cylinder gasoline engine of the kind that had proven reliable across years of commercial service. For the rear wheels, the engineer specified a partial track system, 2 sets of short tracks replacing the rear axle tires, intended to improve cross-country mobility in the jungle and broken terrain that characterized the potential operational environment. The steel body that rose from this chassis was fabricated with the angled surfaces that Leonardo's notebooks had inspired, resulting in a structure that sloped inward from a wider base to a narrower upper section, topped with a small rotating turret mounting a British-manufactured machine gun. The frontal plate was 15 millimeters thick, a figure that, measured against the armor standards of European tanks of the same period, was not embarrassing. Several contemporary Soviet designs carried frontal protection in the same range. This number was cited in Venezuelan military publicity of the period as evidence of genuine combat capability. What the publicity did not discuss was the relationship between the thickness of the armor and the geometry of the vehicle's interior, or the implications of that geometry for the people who would have to operate it. The two rectangular apertures cut into the front of the hull, the viewing ports that gave the Tortuga its faintly facial appearance, provided the driver and commander with their only direct visual access to the outside world. The apertures were covered by armored plates that could be swung open when the vehicle was in a secure environment, and closed when it was not. When they were closed, visibility was reduced to whatever could be seen through the narrow gaps. When they were open, the crew had somewhat better sight lines, but was exposed to the kind of small arms fire that the vehicle's armor was specifically designed to defeat. In practical terms, this meant that the vehicle's crew operated in conditions of severe visual limitation under any circumstances that justified closing the protective plates. A driver attempting to navigate terrain features, obstacles, or the enemy positions that were the vehicle's nominal purpose could see an extremely limited portion of the environment through apertures that were positioned by the geometry of the sloped hull at an angle that further compressed the visible field. Veterans who served on the Tortuga described daytime driving as demanding and nighttime driving as something that went beyond demanding into a category of experience that resisted polite description. The engineers at the shipyard addressed the nighttime visibility problem by adding headlamps. This was a reasonable response to an obvious problem. The specific implementation they chose was less reasonable. The headlamps were mounted on the front axle, beneath the overhang of the armored hull, pointing forward and slightly downward from a position that illuminated primarily the ground in front of the vehicle, rather than anything at a useful distance ahead of it. The effect, according to accounts from the period, was that the Tortuga at night appeared to observers at any distance as a moving steel shape emitting light from somewhere near the ground, an appearance that one account compared to a supernatural apparition rather than a military vehicle. The illumination provided to the crew for navigation purposes was marginal. The ventilation situation was worse than marginal. It was absent. Venezuela occupies a tropical latitude. The operational environment for which the Tortuga was designed, the border regions with Colombia and the jungle territories at dispute, features temperatures and humidity levels that would be oppressive in any circumstances. Inside a sealed steel enclosure, those conditions become dangerous within a short time. The crew of 3, driver, commander, gunner, and a second crew member whose specific function in the vehicle was not clearly defined in the design documentation, occupied a space that had no provision for air circulation, no fans, no vents, and no mechanism for exchanging the air inside the hull with the considerably more breathable air outside it. Under equatorial conditions, with a running engine adding heat to the interior and 3 human bodies adding both heat and humidity, the temperature inside the Tortuga during operation reached levels that contemporary accounts describe with the kind of specificity that suggests the writers had direct experience they were trying to convey accurately. The crew did not merely become uncomfortable, they became progressively impaired in the way that humans become impaired when the environment around them is too hot for normal physiological function. Extended operation was not a question of endurance. It was a question of whether the crew would remain conscious. The maintenance access problem was of a different character, but comparable practical consequence. The decision to encase the vehicle's mechanical systems beneath sealed armor plate, without provision for access panels or removable covers, meant that servicing the engine, transmission, or running gear required partially disassembling the vehicle's protective structure. Bolted armor panels had to be removed to reach the components beneath them. In a garrison environment with tools and time, this was inconvenient. In any operational setting where the vehicle had broken down in a location exposed to potential enemy activity, it was a problem without a solution. The Tortuga that stopped running in the wrong place stayed where it stopped. The half-track running gear at the rear, intended to provide the cross-country capability that the vehicle's operational environment demanded, produced handling characteristics that required exceptional physical strength and skill to manage in any terrain that was not flat and firm. The combination of steerable front wheels and non-steerable rear tracks created a vehicle that resisted directional changes with considerable determination. Turning the Tortuga required sustained effort against the mechanical resistance of the drive system, and the turning radius was not compatible with the kind of confined spaces that jungle warfare and village fighting would produce. Accounts of training exercises describe vehicles becoming stuck in positions from which recovery required external assistance, and the assistance available in the field was limited by the same terrain conditions that had caused the problem. The maximum speed achievable on prepared surfaces was low enough that infantry could maintain pace with the vehicle without effort, which was not in itself unusual for armored vehicles of the period, but which, combined with the vehicle's other limitations, suggested that its tactical role in actual combat would have been constrained to whatever the infantry around it was doing, rather than anything the armor could do independently. None of this prevented the parade on the 23rd of December from achieving its intended effect. 12 Tortuga vehicles had been completed. 5 of them appeared at the demonstration in the armored vehicle capital of Maracay. They moved across the parade ground in formation, their steel pyramidal forms catching the light in a way that made them look, depending on the angle and the observer's frame of reference, like moving architectural elements, like animals, or like nothing in any prior experience of military equipment. The foreign military attachés present made the notes they were paid to make. The Venezuelan crowd responded with the kind of attention that genuinely novel spectacle reliably produces, and the man in the rocking chair, watching from the reviewing stand with the satisfaction of someone who has converted a strategic problem into a demonstration of resolve, was justified in his assessment that the afternoon had gone well. The intelligence that reached Colombian military and political circles in the weeks following described Venezuela as possessing armored fighting vehicles of unusual design and unknown capability. The specific characteristics of the vehicles, their inability to see clearly, their susceptibility to heat-related crew incapacitation, their maintenance inaccessibility, their modest road speed, were not information that Colombian intelligence was positioned to acquire because Venezuelan security around the program was sufficient to prevent detailed assessment from outside. What Colombian planners knew was that Venezuela had armor. They had none. They had watched the Colombo-Peruvian conflict proceed without either side deploying armored vehicles, and they understood, as any professional military planner would, that the addition of armor to one side of an otherwise balanced confrontation changes the tactical calculations that govern whether offensive action is advisable. Testing an armored force with unarmored infantry requires either an overwhelming numerical advantage or specific terrain conditions that negate armor's advantages, neither of which Colombia was positioned to guarantee. The territorial pressure on Venezuela eased. The dispute that had seemed to be building toward a military test was resolved through diplomatic channels. No shots were fired. No Tortuga ever engaged a Colombian military unit or was required to demonstrate in combat the characteristics that the parade had implied it possessed. This outcome, judged purely by the standard of whether the Venezuelan government achieved its strategic objective, represents a complete success. The goal was to deter military action by a neighbor that had recently demonstrated willingness to use force in territorial disputes. The Tortuga deterred that action. The fact that it would likely have been a disaster in actual combat, that the crews would have been incapacitated by heat, that the vehicles would have broken down in the jungle and been unrecoverable, that the visibility limitations would have made effective tactical use nearly impossible, is militarily relevant only if the deterrence had failed and combat had occurred. It did not occur. The deterrence worked. This is a distinction that military historians occasionally lose in their enthusiasm for assessing hardware against technical standards. A weapon that is never used in combat cannot be evaluated on combat performance. It can only be evaluated on whether it achieved the purpose for which it was acquired, which in this case was not combat performance but strategic signaling. The Tortuga signaled effectively. Venezuela's territorial integrity was maintained. The assessment of the program should begin and end with that fact, even if the technical footnotes are what make it memorable. The 12 vehicles remained in Venezuelan service for the next 16 years, which is a longer operational life than many more capable armored vehicles from the same period achieved in countries that actually used their equipment in combat. During those years, their primary functions were ceremonial and educational. They appeared at official events, they occupied space in military installations, and they served as a concrete reminder to the population and to visiting observers that Venezuela possessed armored capability. They also, according to several accounts from the period, served as storage structures for various agricultural purposes at military installations where space was at a premium and the vehicle's sealed steel interiors provided a dry and vermin-resistant environment. Military equipment that ends its service life as a grain store or similar facility has been thoroughly repurposed from its original design intent. But the Venezuelan army's practical approach to the Tortuga's declining years reflects a straightforward acknowledgement that the vehicles had completed their actual mission and could now serve whatever purpose was convenient. In 1950, 11 of the 12 were scrapped. The recovered steel went back into the Venezuelan industrial supply chain. The 12th vehicle, a slightly later production variant, was preserved and placed in a military museum, where it has remained as an object of study, of occasional international attention, and of genuine puzzlement from visitors encountering it without prior explanation. The attempted Spanish transaction of the mid-1930s, in which the Republican government of Spain reportedly explored the possibility of acquiring either examples of the vehicle or manufacturing rights, did not proceed to a conclusion. The reasons are not documented with sufficient clarity to support a confident explanation. The most charitable interpretation is that the Spanish assessment of what the Tortuga could actually do in combat led to a conclusion that the acquisition would not serve the military needs of a government facing what was about to become a civil war. The less charitable interpretation is that someone in the Spanish procurement process got a closer look at the vehicle's characteristics and made a practical judgment. The improvised armored vehicles that Spanish Republican forces subsequently built from civilian components in the early stages of the conflict share certain aesthetic qualities with the Tortuga that suggest the Venezuelan design had influenced at least some of the people making decisions about what a locally produced armored vehicle should look like, even if the specific acquisition did not occur. What the Tortuga represents in the history of military technology is not a technical achievement, but a strategic insight that was implemented by unconventional means and achieved its purpose through an application of the logic of deterrence that is often attributed only to nuclear-age strategic thinking, but which is in fact as old as the organized use of force. The insight is that the perceived capability of a weapon and its actual capability are different things, and that in many strategic situations, the perceived capability is what determines outcomes. Colombia in 1934 was not going to test Venezuelan armor. The decision not to test it was made on the basis of what Colombia's leadership believed about Venezuelan armor, not on what Venezuelan armor could actually do. Those two things were significantly different, but only one of them was operationally relevant to the strategic question at hand. The engineer who designed the vehicle by studying Renaissance notebooks and building steel pyramids at a naval shipyard was not producing a technically superior fighting machine. He was producing an argument, a physical, steel-plated, machine gun-equipped argument that Venezuela was prepared to defend its territory and had the hardware to make that defense costly. The argument was sufficient. The territory was defended. This is not a lesson that military procurement offices or defense ministries typically draw from their program reviews. The standard evaluation criteria ask what the equipment can do in combat, how it compares to adversary systems on technical dimensions, whether it can survive the threat environment it will face. These are the right questions for equipment that will be used in combat. They are not the only questions relevant to equipment that will serve primarily as a deterrent. The Tortuga never fought. The Tortuga succeeded. Both of these things are true, and the relationship between them is the story.